Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from sunny West London. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we are joined by Charlotte Rogers, artist, author, magician, animist, and, as a bit of a milestone for me, the first Kiwi accent on the show. Charlotte, thank you for your time.
Absolute pleasure to be here.
That's very nice to hear. Now, the traditional first question, we know some of it already, those of you who have read Charlotte's books, but were you a weird kid?
Yeah, I was, and I don't think my parents quite knew how to cope with me, really. Very, very isolated. I couldn't figure out how people worked. It's like they didn't make sense. It was a pattern that I spent years trying to break and to learn how to communicate with people. And I was just like a lot of my peers, actually. I had my own worlds where I was safe, and there was a way of operating within it that made sense. And I read a lot and never fitted in at school. And I liked bones. And I liked microscopes, and I loved other worlds. I wanted to be an astronaut. I wanted to be an archaeologist. Instead, I was a girl who was brought up in a Catholic background. So I had to really use a different sort of thinking in order to accommodate the ritual and glamour that goes with Catholicism into my own worldview.
And that's an interesting way of putting it. I really like that. So when you talk about building your own world, I mean, one of the things we share is a childhood on at the edge of the empire where your astronaut is not a thing a girl in Wellington gets to be. So that's quite the imagination. I mean, was this pulled from books of other worlds, or do you think you kind of came to this planet with that imaginal capacity?
I think I was just like that. When I think I was about 11 when I first read reference to the Watchers. And, you know, obviously I'd come across some things in the Bible. And it really hit a lot of chords, I think, for me. You know, sort of not fitting in, the whole idea of not fitting in. So with that sort of isolated worldview, just staring at the stars, like, you know, you've lived in New Zealand, and, you know, especially when I was younger, before I moved to the Big Smoke in Wellington, I was living down the South Island a lot, and the ozone's very, very thin around places like Motueka, Nelson, Blenheim. So every night you'll see masses of shooting stars. So the sky is so close. There's not a lot of light pollution, or there wasn't in those days. And it's just like you can almost reach out and touch the sky. And so someone with an imagination who didn't fit into this reality, it just seemed obvious to want to explore further outwards. So, yeah, an astronaut was the obvious thing. But I think I was about 7 when I found out astronauts didn't have glasses, let alone be female and from New Zealand. So that dream died fast.
So going back to what you were saying about how you kind of reposition living in worlds with a Catholic background or a Catholic environment in which you live. I mean, what was that like? Was it using the Catholic structure to go, okay, well, they talk about there's the bits in the Old Testament, there's Watchers, there's Nephilim. Let me go and find what else I can find about that? Or was it a bit more intuitive?
It was a combination. I mean, I was always fascinated with religion. Because I'm quite disassociative in some ways, so I was able to separate intellectually. I was very precocious as a child on that level. And I always had the same beliefs about morality and right and wrong. Although, as you've read in my book, you know that perhaps that didn't work so well sometimes. But as a small child, the concept of sin, I really couldn't grasp. And right and wrong. So I felt from the beginning that the religion wasn't right for me. You know, I did the standing and kneeling and all the recitations, but it felt empty. And I knew from a very young age there was supposed to be something behind that. You were supposed to do it with feeling. So I just always felt it was wasn't right. And I read the books. I argued with teachers at school about it. By the time I made my first Holy Communion, but by the time I was 11, I'd settled in a school in Wellington, and we were starting to prep for confirmation, and I refused. I knew by then that I just refused anymore because it was too important to commitment, even at that age. I just knew that I didn't want to take another step. I wasn't going to commit to something that was so important. I've just always had, in my worldview, I believe that people tend to structure their thinking according to like an inner self. Like some people rearrange their reality in philosophical terms, some people in political terms, and some people in spiritual terms. And I've always, interpreted reality in terms that make sense to me in spiritual terms. And, so from a young age, it didn't make sense. It didn't fit. So I had no problems backing away from it, but I still found it fascinating. It was like another pattern. And I realized that there were ignoring that pattern because it was this glamour. There were the bells and the smells and this whole thing that if you believed something, you could create. It could cause an effect, and that fascinated me. And I knew I was sort of, that clicked with me.
Well, that's interesting because in many respects, First Communion is a pact. It is a spirit pact. And so there's a kind of innate animistic understanding of what it is. I mean, it wasn't right for you, but in that respect, it also wasn't right for the spirits you were making the pact for because it's like, we don't click. What do you want from me?
Yeah, and I was not going to take that further. I mean, the first Holy Communion in my days, it was very punishment orientated. Like if you opened your mouth, and the host was still in it, your tongue would swell up, turn black, the ground would open, and you'd be hurtled down into the burning coals of hell. Which I found it interesting because I had this concept that I couldn't get my head around sin. So how could there be a hell? I was a nightmare child. It's just like, when you're thinking, and there's just like this block because it doesn't make sense, and you just stand there and you're walking around this block and trying to figure it out, and then you realize that there's no figuring it out. You just have to walk away. So I'd made a commitment to an extent, and I guess I had given it space, accepted it as it was, which was a human construct, with all the mess that goes with it, integrated certain aspects of it into myself. As I said, that the glamour, the concept that belief can change things, and later on in life, the concept of sort of I don't know what you call them, visual memes, or is it memes the word? Like saints.
Yeah.
That are all, sort of can be like archetypes or almost expressions of atavistic consciousness. I don't know. So yeah, I did get something from it. So I feel like I've given back to it in a way, as you do with any pact. And any pact, you can never walk away from it. You do carry a bit of it in yourself, and I feel like I've given that justice, and I still talk about it. So, it's not as if I haven't given a little smidgen of flesh to the belief system.
Yeah, true. Now, had you had any sort of paranormal or supernatural experiences by that age that allowed you to kind of go, all right, there's something here, this bit isn't for me? One of the things I resonated with in your presentation at the Psychoanalysis, Art and Occult Conference was the view of the kind of and I don't mean this negatively, but the sort of banal horror of growing up in somewhere like regional Australia or New Zealand long before the internet. And my experience as a child is that you get less pleasant paranormal experiences in that space from an early age. But I mean, if you're 11 and this is at the stage you're more or less starting to play with tarot cards, so clearly and with a very religious grandmother, was there anything in the sort of early childhood, like, ghosts, that kind of thing?
yeah, things happened. I mean, and I suppose I don't know. I don't talk so much about this stuff. I learned very early on. Um, I sort of see not so much visions, but I see colors. Like for instance, say, and later on, say I'd be in a pub and everything would go red. I knew to get out because there was like violence seeping through. Um, and um, sometimes I'd have like black lines, which meant there was some sort of darkness. It was like an area you just don't go into. So I had that sort of thing. And again, I didn't talk about that. Um, and yeah, there'd be manifestations of stuff. I was pretty messed up as a child in many ways. I was very, very insular. I saw bones as light. I saw that bones weren't just an inanimate object. Um, so yeah, my way of seeing from a very early age was seeing light and darkness, and colours as manifestations of something. It's not aura. I'd never get into describing it as aura, but I would see glowing things. I've never had the voices,
Yeah.
but no, but I know people who do.
Yeah,
But my
sure.
thing seems to be visual. I'm strongly visual. Um, and so when I learnt palmistry, oh God, what must have been about before I learnt it before cards. So because I was fascinated with hands, because I noticed that hands, especially when some people's hands carry light in them, in the center, you can actually see it. And then there are some people when they move their hands, there's a follow through of color or light. And so I was seeing that sort of thing very, very young. Um, but saying, it's hard to say whether something like that is a manifestation, a spiritual manifestation, or a creative manifestation. They just, yeah, I'm not sure, but and yeah, there were ghosts on the odd occasion. And then when I was about 10, and we had a babysitter, a Maori guy called the captain, who must have been quite eccentric. I hadn't thought about this for years. Something brought it up, and he used to brew belladonna
Oh, cool.
and drink it. And it wasn't until I was older I realised what he was doing. But at that stage, it was just my mother was like, oh, I don't know, this strange sort of tea. And I used to get on very well with him. Um, and yeah, I just learned to keep my counsel because I saw things in a way other people do, in a way other people don't. And ghosts, it was more like falling things. One house we lived in, I'd see movements. Again, it was like movements of light, flashes of light, things out of the corner of my eye. Um, so yeah, that's I suppose that's the answer
Yeah.
to the question, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, there is. I just want to touch on the sort of bone relationship.
Mm.
Was that there the whole time? And what were the first bones? I mean, was this sort of um, lamb bones at a meal, or was it on a farm, or were they? Did you see human bones? What was when? Do you have a memory of the first time you kind of
Yeah.
realized there was something that wasn't this?
Yeah. It was. I was living in a place called Timaru, which is like Rednecksville. It's well, I don't know if it's the same, but it's a smallish town. Major income at that point came from sheep farming, sheep shearing, and but there were a lot of old mines around, and I used to go exploring, as one does, and it was quite dry. It must have been summer, so the inside of the mine, it was all like packed yellow soil, very dusty soil, so it was all golden, and there was a um, I don't know, it was a cow or goat, probably something like that bone, and it glowed. Um, but the glow was made up of just like lots and lots of tiny little dots of light, and it moved. Uh, and I took it home, and my father just went absolutely ballistic with me. But that was probably, and also, I suppose if you think seven, Age of Reason, around the time I made my first Holy Communion, that was in Blenheim. Um, and that was quite a defining thing for me, really, because because just the whole light of that tunnel and the light of the bone, it was amazing. Um, and I think it really changed me. I mean, Timaru was a very strange place anyway,
Yeah.
but
It's still that. I haven't been there for a while, but it definitely seems like it was that last time I was there.
well, years later, I went through there and I got arrested by the police, and they were straight out of some sort of middle American drama, absolutely horrific. And that was like, must have been about 15 years later, and it was still not a nice place. But yeah, that was huge for me.
And
And
it was in the underworld too. You were literally underground.
yeah, oh yeah, I never thought of that. But it was just it was beautiful. It really was beautiful, because that was around the same time I got my subscription for Man, Myth and Magic. I think, yeah. Because I used to get book vouchers for birthdays because they didn't know what to give me, and they didn't want to give me a chemistry set because I was, a little bit exploratory. Um, and there was the serialization of it in magazine form, and I got a subscription from the newsagent. God knows why they gave it to me. And again, my father went ballistic because there was various pictures of cavorting naked witches. It was the same year that I saw my first image of the Hand of Glory, and that was like, whoa. And also there was Austin Osman Spare in there, and it imprinted on my mind because the sigilization technique, I must have read about it at that age because I was doing it later on without having come in contact with any more of his work, because, come on, this was in New Zealand, for God's sake. But I must have, before my father went ballistic again and returned magazines, I must have picked up on something. But the Hand of Glory, when I later saw it in the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle, years later, it was like, wow, this is the way my life is meant to be. I'm sort of on track in some horribly painful, confusing, sort of crazy way. But yeah, all when I was 7, and all those happened in a similar sort of time frame in Timaru.
Man, Myth and Magic is ambitious for a 7-year-old. That's
Well, I suppose it was. Sometimes I feel like I was brighter and more onto it before I actually hit puberty, and then just hormones and at puberty suddenly the onus is more on. I don't know if it's, there's more importance in how you relate to human beings once you hit puberty. Suddenly it becomes a lot more significant, your relationships with other people, and the inner relationships sort of get pushed aside, really. That's what I think, for me anyway. Especially if you go to girls' schools and there's this huge onus on the way you relate to the opposite sex. It doesn't even come into consideration the fact that it might not be the opposite sex you're interested in. But, so everything sort of went backwards with puberty because I started working on a very mundane level, which I couldn't do, so I just got stoned.
Well, actually, that kind of leads us into the next bit that I definitely want to talk about, because as I said in the presentation, it was like you were describing parts of my own childhood, even though there's a different decade, different country, but the same issue, which is what are your impressions of sort of growing up or coming of age a bit different somewhere like New Zealand, because you've lived quite a number of places. And you had a family that had, as did mine, had relationships, like living relationships with other parts of the world, and yet you were still in New Zealand. And there is some kind of dissonance that goes on with being, mine was Newcastle, Australia, so it's a regional coal mining town, kind of similar in that respect. And there was this peculiar kind of horrific boredom that I think underpins a lot of questionable decisions and explorations. But if you want to talk about that in the terms of your own life, that feeling, that distance feeling, that would be very interesting.
I'm just trying to work out. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I don't know if you did the same thing, because there'd be these mad commutes. Like, I'd be living in squats or house trucks in New Zealand and then go to Hong Kong to visit my family, which was just like a completely different world. And you know, it all was surface stuff. I just went with the flow, really. I never made decisions. Um, I constantly was searching for people like me that I could communicate with. And that caused some really messy decisions because there was, I think, at core, because I felt so alone and so bored, as you say, or restless, and I wanted to experiment with life. So the people I gravitated towards were very nihilistic. Um, yeah, it's sort of like I didn't want to. I was brought up very much in some ways to be a wife.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I think my generation. I wasn't encouraged to do academic or creative things. And yeah, I just felt there was no place for me. And yeah, there was no internet. And so the group of people that I gravitated towards initially were what were known as the educated junkies, aka the Burroughs set, and that they could spout all sorts of wonderfully creative drug addicts. And read Philip K. Dick and all these things I really related to. And I made no decisions. I just thought, wow, these people are like me, get involved with them because this is a more interesting life. Um, and New Zealand just seemed, yeah, it was painful because trying to find a place where my way of thinking and being fitted in. Um, I made some. I didn't make any decisions. I just ran frantically. I think just looking for peers. Um, and New Zealand was very small, very very judgmental. I don't know what the area you were in Australia was like, but it was very very narrow. So there's a saying in New Zealand that you could go to a pub in a town you've never been in and say five names to a complete stranger, and they'll know at least three of them. Um, so if you go against the norm, you will get known and not forgotten.
There was a bit of that in 80s Newcastle, definitely. That was the fascinating thing to me because that was pre-internet as well, and I get these books. I had a lovely woman who ran. It's gone now, as all good independent bookstores are. This amazing woman who ran this bookstore a couple of miles walk from my house. And she would kind of ring me up if she found something. So there was a secondhand Israel Regardie Golden Dawn, that kind of thing. And she'd ring up and say, Gordon, I think you'd like this. So there was these jewels that would come from somewhere else in the world where there were people like me and they were not around. And that kind of, it was very dissociative to know that they existed, but they were not around here. And there was something in that, for me anyway, like the horror was quite Lovecraftian in the sense that it just kind of it seeped up. And I love New Zealand, I love Australia, but this was not. It was not a judgment on the country or the land necessarily. It was this weird sense of banality that was terrifying, but also ultimately creative, because you do make some poor decisions, you make some good ones, and eventually, as you did, which we'll also talk about, you do eventually go and find the others.
Well, I think part of it is about the land as well. I mean, there's the people that settle the land, and I think in order to, because they're both young countries, in order to make your mark on that landscape or just survive, you have to be, I don't know if base is the word from it, because my mother's adopted family were farmers. You have to operate on a very, very mundane, pragmatic level. You think in New Zealand, proverbial New Zealand male, sort of walks as if they've got the most enormous hard-on in the world. They sort of roll from side to side, and it's very masculine, and it's very, very earthy. So, and it's hard living. So, in order to survive, I guess there's been this persona constructed of a very, very straight, aggressive, sort of masculine sort of persona. I'm repeating myself a bit here. And the land has got a strange energy, because I think when you've got a land that seems so harsh, it's almost like you go into battle with it. So I think a combination, for me anyway, of the 80s, puberty, trying to find my space, and this really, really crazy landscape, full of history, but not full of history. And it's all, there's a form of madness in it. And I think a lot of people don't actually survive the transition to finding who they are, like my peers didn't. I'd say easily about 75% of them are gone. Yeah, so the land in New Zealand is very, very odd. There was this, I don't know if it's true or not, but there was an urban myth that at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, the turn of it, that some Golden Dawn members came over to New Zealand, and down the west coast, there's this road that just runs down the whole of the west coast. That is absolutely crazy. There's actually carved mushrooms in one hillside, and apparently there was a Maori tribe there that used to worship mushrooms. And it is just, it's like plugging in to this crazy energy. And they said that these Golden Dawn members came down to see the start of the new century there because it was such a power point. And interestingly enough, that's where a lot of people like myself with a spiritual bent, trying to find their home and their individuality and peers, they just went completely ballistic around there. So the land in itself it's an odd landscape. And I don't think the Westerners who settled there, I don't think the mindset was configured to be able to cope with that. Because as you know, working with spirits, you clothe them in your own experience and your ability to open your comprehension to understand them. And if you can't, you've got to find a survival technique, either being very, very earthy or going a bit nuts.
Yeah, that's hugely insightful. It's the inability to, and funnily enough, this extends. I tell my London friends that there are more angry ghosts in the rocks in Sydney than I ever find in London, and it's because you have these dead people who have mutated away, as you say, into an earthy thing. Because the horror of looking at it, like to have this phenomenological experience that you don't put symbols or words around and you just pretend isn't there and close yourself off to it. When you die, you have a classic ancient Greek restless dead situation. And the ghosts I would encounter in Sydney are like unto nothing I experience. And I spend a lot of time in tombs here, you know. So, but this is the soil for them. My read of it, and it's only mildly racially insensitive, but my read of it is that this is where we're Maori. So this is where our soil is, and you have these broken people that were buried, especially you go back to even as late as the mid 20th century. New Zealand and Australia were part of England, like in their heads, that's what they were. So if you bury these broken men in particular in a foreign soil that they haven't engaged with, you get some really freaky ghosts.
No, I agree completely. My grandmother used to take us for picnics. I mean, she was a sick woman, to a place called Dead Man's Creek, near Blenheim. And it was a sort of dried up creek where a New Zealand settler, I think he'd done something wrong and had been hunted down, and he'd been killed there. And you felt it. I mean, you felt it. It was just horrible. And then there's places down the coast again where hitchhikers disappeared, you know, and they never found what happened to them. A bit like Australia, because I think Australia's got the highest degree of serial killers.
Probably per capita, that would be something we'd have.
Yeah, and there's just so much space. It's a bit, okay, we'll go right off, like with the Vietnam War. People are given an opportunity to go as far as they can and get away with it. And I think in Australia and New Zealand, because even though New Zealand's smaller, you can just disappear. And when the land has a certain sort of madness and it's full of unrecognised dead, they latch on to that. And it can cause just such destructive madness. And the West Coast is full of a lot of that because, you know, there's been mining accidents. It's very interesting.
My West Coast experience when I was living in New Zealand, my mother came over for a holiday and we did a road trip because she'd never really done the South Island other than skiing. And so we went down the West Coast, and she's very clairvoyant. She's an energy healer and all this. She's been on the show. And we were seeing, like, she described it to me when we were I think we were in the Greenstone Museum is that in Greymouth? Anyway, it's somewhere like
Greymouth
that.
Is unbelievable.
Yeah. And there were these depictions of Taniwha, and she's like, that's what I've been seeing swimming in the water.
Hmm.
And when we would go through the sort of big fern forests, she would see like live fern spirits, just as if, like, just I'm looking at my window at a tree now. Like the West Coast is, it's barely solid so far into the spirit world it is.
But I think I mentioned it at the talk I gave, the Jazz Coleman talk I went to see. And it was at a culture some years ago. Amazing event. God knows, well, they never got the funding again, I think, but it was wonderful. But Jazz Coleman did this presentation, and he's got a home in New Zealand, but he's also got a home in Iceland. And his theory was that Iceland is the entrance to Universe A, and New Zealand is the entrance to Universe B.
Yeah, you did mention it. I love this. Carry on.
And it and in it, well, the way he presented it was he did two musical compositions, one for New Zealand, one for Iceland. And Iceland was beautiful. It was exquisite. It was neoclassical, very, very cerebral, clean, and just. And New Zealand, bass orientated. It was a film, body painting, fire at night. It was a chaotic, very, very, sort of dark madness. And that was the New Zealand I knew. That was, and I don't know where he is. I don't think he's on a mainland. He might be on one of the islands or something. But that was the New Zealand I knew, and he picked up on it. And it was the entrance to Universe B. And it was just this combination of this young country, this old country. I mean, as you said, the fern spirits are unbelievable. There's such beauty, but there's just such craziness just waiting to happen. And the West Coast, around the South Island, is I suppose, the closest I would say to, in all of New Zealand. It just is stunning. It just clicks into me, but it's dangerous for me. I could never cope with it. I had to get out. It's just so alive, but it's very, very dark.
It is, and the dissociation kind of goes. There's a colonial dissociation that animists will experience, which is, as you say, it's very old and very alive, but the colonizers have a very shallow root system to their phenomenology or to their sort of spirit language. Mm. And that was particularly acute for me in Australia, where, I mean, the Australian Aboriginal nations are the oldest continually existing cultures on the planet. Mm-hmm. So we have this extremely new cultural layer over a way of being with the land that is literally the oldest we can find, and I didn't have access to. Obviously, I didn't have access to it, but I knew it was there. You could feel it. I remember my first quite botched sort of self-initiation, as you do with a few Llewellyn books, at the top of this waterfall in a place called Glenrock Lagoon. Mm-hmm. And I describe it as Cthulhu Dundee showed up, because I was calling the wrong things in the wrong place. I didn't know any better, largely because the books had told me that they are kind of interrelated, you can replace one with the other, and you sort of can't. And I was basically on the wrong kind of sacred ground, and it was very terrifying. And that kind of experience doesn't happen because if you look at, say, for me anyway, this is my interpretation of why it's different in the UK. If you read between the lines of the grimoire tradition, you see that the people who were practicing magic, certainly, I mean, we don't know what the names of the Celtic and whatever gods were, and we never will. We've just got some Roman mistranslations of a late stage. But they were nuanced enough to build the local land spirits into their kind of folk Christianity, so that they could still engage with them. So you have demons, and you have the devil as a replacement for all manner of landscape pieces and all this kind of thing, and it provides a way of triangulating your experience with the spirit world and the land that was just I didn't have in Australia. And that was one of the things, I think, and this is, now we get to the next kind of classic Antipodean storyline, unless we want to comment, but that was one of the things that triggered I always knew I was going to leave, was because I was looking for, again, to be racially insensitive, where I could be Maori.
Mm-hmm. Are you still there?
Yep, still here.
Yep. Yeah, I don't know. So, where is your home? Where do you feel? Oh, I'm asking the question. I'm just curious to know. Is there any? Where do you feel your home is?
So I have I split the difference on this, and I separate birth from home, like so birthplace from home. Australia will always be the birthplace, and it has a thing, but home for me requires a constellation of factors. So either here or and second place would actually be New Zealand, because it is here is where I get the most of the pieces. Stable relationship, understanding of the topography, a access to the spirit world that matches how I am built better, and all those kind of things. So, but like to be honest, home has moved. When I moved to New Zealand, I thought that would solve it. I thought it was about leaving Australia as opposed to potentially finding what I was looking for. So for 6 years there, I thought it was going to be New Zealand.
You're the inverse to me because I moved to Australia.
And yeah, you like Melbourne. So let's do that. Let's do like the Antipodean questing. What were your impressions of Melbourne? Why did you like it so much?
Well, culturally, it was very mixed. Uh, yeah, I think that was part of it, and the music. The music in Melbourne at that time was phenomenal. But I sort of fell there really because I'd lived in London for a while, and we're talking like Thatcher London. It was just horrendous. Um, and then I tried Hong Kong again. I just sort of fell into Melbourne, and I don't know. It was just there was a buzz. There were so many different cultures there. Um, I loved the light, and yeah, the music blew my mind. And it was a nice rest for me. And at that stage, I was still working in brothels, and it was legal. There were legal brothels there, that were relatively protected. Okay, they were basically at core they were run by criminals, but so at work. I think I briefly tried doing a telesales job, but it just seemed easier being a prostitute. um, which is perhaps there's something again going back to the morality question, but no, so it just worked for me, but I had to go back to New Zealand another time. I sort of fell in love with someone and ended up moving back to New Zealand, and I still had some living there to do. Um, but yeah, it was like, you know how you said that about there's a safety for me with England. Perhaps don't have the same. I work with the land here, but I don't have the same resonance. For me to come alive again, I need to go to Asia. I don't know why, but it's just like I go to Asia and it's like I blossom. There's something about it, and it just fits everything about me. My worldview, the way I relate to the land, it's like I come alive. That's why I go there every year, different parts of it. But England there's a safety here for me. It's given me a backbone and a strength, which I probably am only really acknowledging through talking about it at the moment. And I don't know if that's because of genetics or what, but the land works for me in that respect. Um, there's not this hysterical need for searching and flailing around. It's just here, and it
Yes,
flows through me.
that's exactly it. I mean, like yourself, I quite like traveling and I quite like
Mm,
exploring, but now that I found this, I don't think it'll go away. Like
mm,
I won't be looking for this anymore. I will be looking for other things, and that is. So, do you think you had because you've lived a number of places? Were you going just with the flow, or did you have an awareness that it was always going to be London, even if the first couple of times maybe didn't pan out the way you had intended?
no, I was going with the flow. I think initially I tossed a coin, my first big trip, and I tossed a coin between New York and London, and I ended up with London. Um, so it was going with the flow, and then and I moved out. I left there some years ago, and it ended up very beautiful. And even though politically I'm very unsure about what's happening with London at the moment, but I love the place. I really, my relationship with I've really got a thing for it. I do love the feel of it. And I think, we were going back to the dead before. The thing is, the dead in London are acknowledged.
Yeah,
to an extent, like anyone who lives there and paces the place, you're walking on layers and layers of the past. And even if that acknowledgement is fleeting, every tourist knows that they're walking on history. But in Australia and New Zealand, there isn't that same sort of acknowledgement, and the dead know it.
No, absolutely, and even at a materialist level, so that when they were building the Gherkin and they found that grave of an unknown Roman little girl, that she was reinstalled in front of it once it was examined, and it's basically to all the unknown dead as a memorial at the front of the Gherkin. So you're right in the middle of potentially the most toxic parts of London, which is its runaway financialism. But even there, at that level, there is a sensitivity which is not found in Australia.
Which is very odd because the landscape is so dramatic. The land is so huge that you think there would be more onus to do that. I suppose things are shifting, especially in New Zealand, in some respects. When I went back for the first time in 25 years, there are a lot of changes. Made me realise I'm a bit older and I'm part of history. And I was actually able to access some very good books there that wouldn't have been available in the 80s.
So you had, yours were typically Charlotte-style unique adventures, but you had a very classically Antipodean experience of working in pubs and squats and the likes of Earl's Court. Was that? Tell me about that, because that's what people expect of us.
Well, what was I doing? Yeah, because I'd moved over from Hong Kong, and I briefly stayed with someone I knew there, but I ended up in trouble very, very quickly. And there was sort of one of those boarding houses in Earl's Court, and that they were right into money making. So I was able to sleep on the floor there for a while. And I was in the DSS, and I met this chap who was a cocaine dealing DJ, and he had keys to all these squats. He was twitching away. It was Fulham Broadway. It was a DSS in Fulham Broadway, and which was pretty grim in those days. And he got us into all these squats, and there were a lot of other Antipodeans around the Earl's Court area. But again, it's exactly the same. You meet the people that you really click with. And they tended to come from different countries. I think there was only one Antipodean who ended up being sort of our band of disasters, moving from one squat to another, really. The rest, I didn't. I think because I knew that this 1 year overseas experience, and I really have to, it's not arrogance. I knew that I wasn't going to go back to New Zealand in a year or two and settle down and get a job and get married and have children. It just wasn't part of my makeup. So again, I managed to find the most nihilistic group of people who weren't just getting absolutely pissed every night and partying, because I never fitted in with them, because I tried in New Zealand. I think I was at one school dance. It was my last year at school, and the captain of the first 15 asked me to dance with him. And which was, everyone was just gobsmacked. Charlotte the Freak had sort of nabbed, I won't say his name, his last name was Ramsbottom, but then we went on a date, and it was just a disaster. And it was like that in Earl's Court. Again, it was that whole thing. I just didn't fit in with that worldview. So I got sacked from my pub job. I can't remember why. And then I tried to get another one, and I had no shoes and couldn't understand why they didn't give me the job. When I turned up for the job interview shoeless. So again, it was just easier to drift back into my usual ways of making money because I couldn't get my head around the mainstream. But Earl's Court, it was pretty mad, and I met interesting people, but again, I didn't quite fit in, and I wasn't a good drinker either. That probably alienated me further from them.
Well, one Antipodean you mentioned in one of the books, she would get messages from her television.
She was incredible. I mean, she was amazing. She was frightening. She, but yeah, it's one of those things, I learned a long time ago, because she just had mentioned, it was one of those things when she first mentioned the TV set giving her messages, and I just sort of phased out, and it's like in the back of your consciousness, you're at a party and someone's talking about something, and then and then you sort of hear, oh, and the TV set was switched off at the time. And then it was driving me around the bend, so I unplugged it. And then it gave me the wins and places to the Melbourne Cup. And they were right. So she wanted so much to be an air hostess. All she wanted was to be an ordinary, pretty little dolly bird. She wanted to weigh 8.5 stone and be an air hostess and get married and have children. But the TV set would talk to her, she'd hear voices, and she was just really, really tuned in. But she didn't want to be. Yeah, and then she tracked me down years later. But we clicked. We clicked. But she was quite unbelievable. It's one of those things. Years later, I remember I was going out with someone, and they mentioned they heard voices, and I just thought, oh fuck, not again, not another person who hears voices. And I rang up the Schizophrenic Foundation, I think they were in Manchester, and I had a really good talk with them. And they said, voices aren't a problem. Bearing in mind, my own spirituality, I shouldn't have problems with it. But every now and then you sort of need to look at things, and you're looking at your own judgments as well. And they said, voice, that's just the way some people operate. It's what the voices say and how you react to the voices. That's when issues happen. And this particular woman just wanted to be ordinary in a sort of magazine type mold, but she had this incredible ability. And I think that split caused her to be completely insane. There's no two ways about it. Yeah, she was mad as a brush. It wasn't because of the voices. It was trying to be something she wasn't.
Do you think that was the same with another character from the pubs who used to work at the British Museum that was also in the book?
Oh, he was just lovely. Yeah. Oh, he was.
Do you want to tell that story? That's brilliant.
Oh, yeah. Oh, he was so special. He was in love with me. Again, I think it was more about just finding a like soul, because I was working there was a pub called the Half Moon in Herne Hill, and I was trying to be normal, but I had a habit, so I was sort of trying to cover it all up. I'd never, the whole English thing about pubs is very different from the Antipodes, because here they're like the social centre. You get the same people every night, and he'd come in, and he obviously was on heavy tranquilizers, because he had the protruding lower lip and sort of dry mouth, the very big belly that you get when someone's really been put on some nasty antipsychotics. And he dealt with old books, and then one day voices said these were demonic, and he started destroying them. He lost his job, but he still got invited to things, actually. Donald, that was it. And he was such a sensitive, clever man. So not of this world, which is why I suppose he got involved with books and book restoration. Because you're in a basement room dealing with these beautiful, they're gateways, aren't they? A good book is a gateway. But one day the gateway took him somewhere that he wasn't equipped with, and he just lost it. No, he was a very special soul. I've been very gifted in that way, that both for good and bad, that I've met some extraordinary people. It's quite humbling how many bright lights there are in the world. Just people who burn so bright, and the world isn't equipped to deal with them, and they can't deal with the world. And Donald was one of those. He had a great gift, but he had absolutely no practical skills. And for a while, hiding in that book room in the basement of the British Museum was the right place, but then just couldn't do it anymore. And he did die. I don't know if I mentioned it in the book. He did die. He, alone, found in his room, full of books. But no, he was one of the very special people in my life, and we gelled. We got on because we were able to talk. We shared I don't know, a similar. I suppose you just call it as simple as a magical worldview, and also a similar feeling of being a bit lost. Um, yeah, just wanting people who are on our wavelength. When you find someone like that, the first time you find other magical thinkers, and it's like, wow, and everything
Absolutely.
lights up.
Well, that's neatly teed up the next question, which
Mm.
is, Charlotte, what is animism?
Well, it's everything has a life force, simply enough. Um, yeah, and I've always believed that, but I never really. When I first started referring myself as an animist, partially it was just to be bolshy, because you know what group are you a member of, or what tradition do you subscribe to, or are you a hereditary or this or that, and I have a real problem with names. It's the way I think. I'm not talking about names of people, but names of god forms, um, and the way in which they appear. There's something about it. It doesn't work in my head. So gods, goddesses, hierarchical arrangements. It just doesn't work. And I really tried it, and then I sort of started stripping things down. And partially it's a way of finding myself as well. And when I was in treatment years ago, and there's this whole guff, when you're a member of the fellowship, AA and NA, and it's a spiritual. And what is your personal spirituality? What is your God force? What is greater than you? And I was in Kent at that stage, and it was spring, and everything was alive. Everything was alive. And I just was so aware of it. And then I realized that's how I've always felt. Everything carries life, and it can be worked with, it can be recognized, it can be dark, it can be joyful, whatever, and I don't see the need to give names. I wouldn't say it's not hierarchical, because some things do need to be arranged a bit so that there's no static, shall we say. But yeah, it's just recognition of an inherent life force in everything, an interconnectedness. And as I said earlier, how I see colours and lines and everything, and yeah, it's just this great connectivity. Um, to go into it, and like Asia, I see the belief systems there. I just it works for me. I see trees that share a heart of a village. I see houses built, and they map the human body, and so they're an extension of the person who built them. Um, and I see the same stuff with the work I do. It's and it's there's a practicality to it. There's this wonderful book I read quite recently on Bengali folk tantra, and I've worked with tantric traditions, but again, the language I find personally alienating, all the names and the pronunciation of the names, and okay, call me lazy, but it just doesn't work for me. But in this book on Bengali folk tantra, a stone, the power in a stone, there are special stones, and you find that, like, make a little sort of nest for it in a little shrine, and that's what I did as a kid. Everyone else would be playing in the playground at school, and I'd be I'd be building little areas for what I called fairies to live in, and I'd sort of just arranging a few twigs and a few stones and everything, and it's just the same thing as when I was a little girl, and I just remembered it, but I just had to strip away a lot of the shoulds, the sort of as a woman, when I was very young, I felt magically there was the way I sort of early on picked up. You choose a path, and it can be knowledge, power, or love. And I thought, well, love is too generic because I'm a woman. Power, well, no. I mean, it all boils down to power in the end. I learned that later. But I went for knowledge, and accumulating layers and layers of information, books and da 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 da, and then instruments, paraphernalia. And then I just stripped it all away and got back to that child I was when I was 5 or 6, playing with my sticks and stones. And that's animism. That is the child's vision, pre-puberty, of everything being alive and needing some form of recognition and just trying to communicate with us if we're open to it.
So was the stripping away of the accoutrement, because my next question was going to be what came first, the art or the animism? But you've just described stories of a kid of essentially doing, the being one and the same. But did the kind of, not in a patronizing way, but did taking the art thing seriously as a journey happen as a result of this stripping away of all the accoutrement?
Um, Let me see, yeah, because when I was very young, I was into writing, and playing around with words because I found it fascinating. And my sister was an artist, but I always did this bone thing. By my teens, I was heavily into it and creating creatures and fetishes. Um, and let me see, I'm just trying to think. Yeah, and in my teens, I also, yeah, like you, I had the Regardie book and the Golden Dawn. That was a bit of a Bible. Yeah, and I started, with my knives and everything. And I think I continued that probably into my 30s. And the art was not art per se, it was just what I did. Um, and then I started stripping back all the tools, yeah, in my mid 30s, I'd say. And then I had a bit of an epiphany, in a very probably cliched way. I went to the Museum of Boscastle about 15 years ago, and it's just looking around. I've been there before, but and it just said, just start making things again. And it wasn't, to be an artist, but it was because it's the greatest experience. The greatest way for me to experience my magic is through making things. And okay, on a basic level, I get things done. I'll get more things done if I get a bone and a twig and wrap a bit of nettle cord around it than I would if I do cord gateways or that can be powerful, and I do have the ability to affect change like that. But just going back to basics and my core self, that's when I really get things done, both within myself and on an outer world, on a mundane level. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, well, it did, because if
They sort of went hand in hand, I suppose. But art as like a career move or whatever, I don't know if career move's the right word for it. That's been a more recent thing, because it's fun. But it's been part of my magical praxis, and the more I've dropped away with the conventional tools of ritual magic, and the more I've grown in myself and my confidence, the stronger an element the creative and artistic process has become.
so, do you think, given that you said you've sort of always made these, and it turns out these fetishes, it's funny how these stories or realizations come through out of sequence. So you were doing them before you had words for them, and then you were doing them when you had words for them, but you also had probably surplus mental furniture to go along with magic, and then that ended. And there's a do you think the kind of luck that you describe at the end of P is for Prostitution, well, do you think that is like an ongoing interaction between yourself and the spirit world from an early age, because you've effectively found that animist expression at an extremely young age, underground with a glowing bone, like Hecate, no less?
Um,
Like, do you think the luck in your life is that kind of non-verbal proficiency with non-verbal magic?
Yes. When I cleaned up at 30, I had reached a point where I'll use magic in the most general terms. It couldn't save me anymore. I realized that I could not work. How can you call it? You could call it the current. I couldn't. I had no control over my relationship with spirits and with realities anymore. Or not. No symbiotic control, shall we call it, for want of a better phrase, because it works several ways. Like it's very mundane. I'd be withdrawing, and I'd find £10, which would give me enough for a hit. I'd find bags of smack to keep me going. I'd find just enough money to, feed my cats, for instance. And I was very, very lucky. But I think it was a combination of the way I worked with my realities, I suppose. But I reached a point where I'd become disconnected, and I'd lost all my survival, and I'd lost that connection, and I knew it. That was the thing. I knew it. And it felt like I'd lost me. And okay, it could be in some respects you think a standard, sort of tale of a rock bottom or whatever. And as Jung says, and I mentioned earlier, this whole spiritual disease. But I had lost my core spirituality, which connected me to everything else. And, that was what forced me to clean up. And then when I got sober and was going through all this sort of rehabilitation and treatment centres and and they were saying, no, this is the wrong sort of spirituality, blah, blah, blah. But I reached the point where I had to return to that to be me. And then it's like, boom. And I have this incredibly wonderful life. Yeah, things go wrong because I'm human. But when I work with that spirituality, that magic, that, I don't know, animist current or whatever, life is okay. It's all right. It works. I'm not loaded with money. But for someone, especially with the background I'm from, I am so loved. Now a blackbird just flew down and sat in front of me then. Yeah, I am so loved. And very, very gifted. And I do believe that is part of recognizing who I am, and yeah, it's a gift. Why I have this gift and what it's for, I don't know, but I have to work it, obviously. I don't want to sound too egocentric, but I'm very, very gifted and very lucky. But there's something beyond that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that brings it doesn't sound egocentric at all, but if there are people out there who are resonating with, I feel like you're kind of describing how I interact. I mean, do you have advice for people who are like, no, this animist thing, this animist worldview, on an experiential basis is something I want to explore? Like, what tips and tricks? Is it make things? Are there books you like?
With books, I mean, I like children's books, and when I travel the world, I buy children's books from different cultures, because, as I said, it's stripped away stuff, and it illustrates mythology in very simplistic terms. Like I've got Nepalese spirit books, and the Nepalese giggle at farting. Malaysian and Indonesian spirit books, they're pretty grim. They're really, really scary, very, very dark stuff. So I like things like that. I don't read that many magical texts anymore. I occasionally I do. I've got some sociological ones, and things like Mama Lola, for instance, are wonderful. Voodoo Priest in Brooklyn. Have you read that?
Yes.
And that's phenomenal because there are things in that talk about morality, the morality of magic. She's so-called flawed, but there's that element of survival. How she works with the spirits, but also how she works with mundane reality, and the whole thing about suspending morality in view of the world you live in. She says in Haiti, love becomes a commodity when you pour. So things like that I love. The book on Bengali Tantra, absolutely wonderful. So I tend to read perhaps some more dry books on folklore. Yeah, I like stories, but also some more anthropological ones. And you just find the odd little thing. You think, yeah, that's me. That's me.
Well, so that the books you've just described there, I could clump into a category of what you were looking for is a shared deep structure of spirit engagement that can be found across cultures. Because that, rather than the kind of very Western cookbook recipe approach to magic, what that does is give you a framework for individualized exploration so that you can read these books and then go out into the woods and say hello?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, because I did my ritual magic stint, um, and I've worked with other people who still work like that, even though that's not my thing. But it's because I'm a bit of a battery. So even though, if I don't aren't good with the titles, aren't good, because some people probably wouldn't like me saying this, aren't good with that particular sort of way of arranging reality, be it Egyptian magic or whatever, even if I don't resonate necessarily with that on the upper level, I can access the core form that they're working with. And so I can work with other people from other traditions if it's the right sort of group. But I prefer not to do that anymore. Um, yeah, I do like working with other people, but I've got less and less into it. I sort of needed to for a while because I just felt like, did you ever go through a phase you feel like you should be disciplined? I don't know where the hell that comes from. You should sit
Yeah,
down.
yeah.
Yeah,
The Protestant work ethic disease in magic,
yeah.
which isn't found which isn't found anywhere outside of the sort of Protestant structure. You do magic when you need it. And otherwise it's an expression of life rather than, sort of staying up all night studying for exams.
Mm-hmm.
But that's historically very new as well. I mean, that's a side effect of the Golden Dawn, trying to pretend that they were their own little version of Freemasonry with, degrees and what have you. But the grimoiric practices prior to that, so kind of, well, at least from the Renaissance up, people have an intellectual interest in the stuff they're studying, but they weren't spending every night working up through grades because there were no grades. And then some of the people who were accused of witchcraft who were caught with these books in the woods, basically illiterate women and men who were using the astrological signs in these books for fetishes or talismans, so power objects rather than books. And they certainly weren't. They couldn't read, so they're not, going through this Protestant work ethic. They're sleeping rough.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's more what I relate to because I mean, yeah, I still read quite a lot, but I sort of lost the trends. About 15 years ago, I went through a phase where I thought I needed what was going on. Was it about 15 years ago? And there was some interesting stuff then at that time. Some of the Luciferian things, which press a few buttons for me, and I find incredible. I mean, a lot of these people aren't around anymore. Nigel Jackson was doing very good things, it was, and there was some very, very exciting stuff at that point. And of course, when oh God, Andrew Chumley, that was exciting, because I could understand where he was coming from, because he had the same sort of amalgamation of traditions in many respects, the background of different traditions that he was amalgamating into a particular praxis. And yeah, I found it very exciting. But then again, I just reached a point where I needed to step back from the words of others and follow that inner thing. And then it reaches a point where you're still reading, but it's so integrated into your life. Yeah, every now and then something does need to be done. And you actually have to think, I'm a magician. Why have I let my life reach this point when I should just do something about it? No, and actually get down to doing some work. But yeah, it just becomes part of your life. On one hand, there's the intellectual interest. Then there's a physical interest, which is quite joyful, because when you're tapped in, I mean, really, remember when I was talking about that whole choice between love, knowledge, and power? And anyone who's, done a good ritual and you're like plugged into 50,000 volts and lighting up and it's like, whoa, and you realize it's all about power and how you work with it. That's sort of first lesson, really, isn't it? So there's that whole physical element. But yeah, it becomes part of your life. There's just no two ways about it. And once you accept that, because that's pact working, isn't it?
Yeah,
there's no stepping back.
No, and the part of your life part I find interesting now at kind of this stage, certainly like yourself, not making any kind of expert claims. But I don't understand why someone would want to separate out the difference between, say, divination or a sense of how things will go, whether they will go good or bad, and thus the avoidance of the bad ones, and enchanting to get a good outcome. Like if it becomes integrated and it becomes something that happens every day, and it's only occasionally that when things go awry and you go, oh, that's right, I know how to do magic. Why?
Yeah.
Why am I not applying this? Yeah.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it, when you realise that? It's like,
All right. Well, Charlotte, this has been absolutely wonderful.
yeah. I hope it didn't jump around too much, and I hope you got what you wanted.
Oh, I certainly did. But for other people
yeah.
who are listening who would like to know more, where would they go to find out more about yourself?
Okay, let me see. I suppose if you go onto my website, which is www.perdurabu.com / and then I'm on Facebook. I've got an art page on Facebook, which is probably, I mean, there's a degree of social networking, I suppose, that's almost necessary.
Yeah.
But I'm not very good at it. I suppose I don't want to be. I just want to make my creatures. That's at the moment, that is what I'm getting my most joy from in life at the moment. And it just seems to be working.
Wonderful. And all these and the links to your books will be up in the show notes for everyone listening as well, so that we can follow up. No, absolutely.
Okay. Well, it's been fun talking to you.
Always a pleasure.
I'll go inside and release my dogs. I was actually going to give you some of the books that were in my bookcase, but it means I'll have to beat my way through the dogs. So I think that would be a bit chaotic.
The one and only Charlotte Rogers, ladies and gentlemen. Talking bones, art, the restless dead, non-verbal magic, international adventures, and luck. You know the score. If you likey, subscribey, try iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or on YouTube. And join in the conversation at runesoup.com or the RuneSoup Facebook page. Or find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.